Hi, it's John Kelly. In this module, we are going to discuss checklist-based auditing and why it's wrong. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, and checklists can certainly help us be efficient and effective. And we want to follow professional standards, and checklists can certainly prompt us to remind us of the things we're supposed to follow in professional standards. And we want to document what we have done properly, and again, checklists can help. Now, the purpose of a checklist is, I think, to be a prompt, and it is to remind us of the requirements of professional standards. There are a lot of things we have to do in an audit. We want to make sure we remember to do them all. A checklist, however, is not going to provide all the required documentation. It can help. It's certainly not going to replace professional judgment of the auditor. Hopefully, it will be a support to professional judgment, but it will not replace it. And it's certainly not to allow auditing without thinking. It's not to allow mindless completion of a checklist. Tick, 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 I'm done the audit. That is not the purpose of a checklist. Now, sometimes it may be that ticking off a checklist step may be enough documentation. And maybe for some or many steps, it's going to depend a little on what risk of material misstatement is. If risk of material misstatement is low or negligible, well, you know what? Many times all we will need to do is tick off a checklist step. Again, auditor judgment is needed, and even with the best of checklists, it may well be that you come to a place where you need to write down a little more than is required or allowed in the checklist, and the auditor should use judgment and produce the additional documentation. Now, for instance, if the required activity is consider, and there are many times in professional standards that that's what we are to do, well, the checklist may well be enough. 24023 requires the auditor to consider if other information obtained in the audit indicates fraud. And a positive checklist response, I considered that and didn't find anything, is probably enough, particularly if I considered it and I didn't find anything. So there's a good example of where checklist is very useful to remind us that's something we're supposed to do, and having ticked off the checklist step, that's probably satisfactory documentation. Now, if it's not satisfactory documentation, you should, of course, prepare a working paper. And there's no way that a single practical checklist will be able to cover every eventuality. The checklist would get so long it would be impractical. So I think I've said this 9 times, auditor judgment is needed. Now, for instance, a bad checklist. An inspector gave us a checklist for business acquisitions. And the first thing that was wrong with this checklist was all it really was an accounting checklist. It went through the accounting process for how one would account for an acquisition. Now, that's management's job, selecting the proper way to account for an acquisition, and the auditor shouldn't be making that decision or going through that thought process. The auditor should be evaluating management's decision of what should be done. So we should be auditing and not making financial statement disclosure decisions. And the second problem with the checklist, there were no audit questions. There were no obtain evidence that questions. They were just, if the acquisition is this, it should be that question. So it was a checklist, but it wasn't a particularly good checklist, and it wasn't an audit checklist. But it made for pretty documentation. We got to put a pretty checklist in the file, and everybody liked it. Now, the real audit decision that should have been made was we should have made and assessed a decision about the risk of material misstatement, that the accounting for the acquisition by the client was wrong. In this particular case, in our client's circumstance, risk of material misstatement was either low or negligible. There was really only one way for them to do it. And we really probably shouldn't have spent a lot of time thinking about it because of risk of material misstatement. So the standards would have called for not much work, and certainly we shouldn't have reperformed the accounting decision. Reperforming the accounting decision didn't audit the matter. So that was a risk of checklist auditing. We merely redid the accounting. We didn't do anything audit-like. We didn't assess risk of material misstatement, and indeed it allowed for auditing without thinking. We can now just fill out that checklist, put it in the file, and everybody says, what wonderful documentation. But we're really wasting our time and weren't doing anything that was related to auditing. So checklists can certainly help. They can prompt us. They can remind us. There's a long list of things that we have to do, and I couldn't remember them all. So I appreciate the prompts in the checklist to say, remember to think about this, remember to think about that, remember to think about this. And you do and go, well, that's not significant. That's unimportant. That's not relevant. So that's fine, but you document that. You tick off the checks in the step list, and it's an efficient way to document. But auditor judgment and the process of assessing risk of material misstatement is most important, and the checklist should remind us to do that too. So, thanks for listening.